Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this additional meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. We'll take the agenda in the order that's been distributed, starting with apologies. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from Councillor Butt, from Councillor Dunlop and from Councillor McCormack. And then going on to the second item, Chairman, Councillor Anne Stribley is substituting for Councillor Dunlop.
Thank you. That takes us on to item 3 on the agenda, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations? There appear not to be. Item 4, confirmation of minutes. And I'm asked to sign as a correct record the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of October 2019. Could I have a show of hands for those who are in agreement that they're an accurate record? Councillor Cox.
I got a slight problem with them insofar as I did ask for something to be in the minutes and they don't appear to be in the minutes. I did ask for the letter from Mr. Roger West to be recorded as having been received and being dealt with, and that is not in the minutes, and I want it to be in the minutes if possible.
Mr. Hanton?
Letter from Roger West.
Mr. Hanton doesn't seem to recall exactly what it is that you mean. Could you explain further, Councillor Cox?
At some point during the meeting, the last meeting, I did actually raise the point of the letter that we'd all received from Roger West, and I did ask for it to be noted, and that the Chief Executive was to deal with it. And I think the Chief Executive is confirming that I did actually say that.
Could I just ask the Chief Executive to comment, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, there was a very brief discussion at the end, and I think I said I would report back to the members of the committee separately. So I think there was a short discussion. It was only a very short item. I think that is my recollection of the request from Councillor Cox.
I can certainly include that. I can certainly include that in the minutes. In that case, as an extra light, in this item when we're approving the minutes, I can note that it's subject to that.
Is that what you would find satisfactory? Thank you very much, Councillor Cox. Thank you. I'm sorry, Councillor West, we haven't got to your items yet, but we will very shortly. I'm sorry, Mr. West, your point is?
No, that he is here. He's saying he is here.
No, he's saying can't hear. Can't hear the discussion.
Well, we're on microphones. I can't enhance those, I'm afraid.
The microphones are set on the normal setting, so other than just kind of speaking perhaps a bit closer, that helps.
Councillor Andrews? Thank you. That would be very welcome, Councillor Andrews. Thank you. You are proposing. Are they seconded?
Subject to that.
Indeed, absolutely. Could I have a show of hands? All those in favour, please indicate.
That's unanimous, apart from Councillor White, who wasn't at the last meeting.
Thank you very much indeed, members. That takes us on to item 5 on the agenda, public issues. We have a member of the public with us, Mr. West, who has 2 questions to ask. And I'd ask Mr. West if you could deal with the first one, to which I will respond, and then we'll move on to the second one once I've done that. Mr. West.
That's it. Well done.
Much better than my days. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can all understand me. My voice is very strange. I don't hear what I actually speak. My first question is, how was it possible that the Hinton Community Association has not prepared audited accounts for many years, whilst being managed by an employee of Bournemouth Borough Council. During this time, I have been informed that over £100,000 has been found to be missing.
Thank you, Mr. West. The answer is relatively long because I need to quote from the Charity Commission, so if everybody could bear with me about the length of the response, which is that the police, Legacy, Bournemouth Borough Council and the independent investigator appointed by the Legacy Bournemouth Borough Council with the agreement of the Kinston Community Association have not been provided with any evidence to substantiate allegations of theft of any financial sum or any other financial wrongdoing. The failure to prepare audited accounts is a matter for the Kinston Community Association and the Charity Commission. The following press release has recently been made by the Charity Commission, and it is this, that the Charity Commission has opened an inquiry into Kinston Community Association due to concerns of mismanagement and or misconduct at the charity. The community centre is set up to promote spiritual, mental, physical and social development to the Kinston community in Bournemouth. The inquiry was opened on the 19th of September 2019. The charity was entered into a class inquiry in February 2018 to look into charities which had repeatedly defaulted on their statutory filing requirements. Despite continued engagement during the course of that inquiry, the charity's financial accounts for the year ending 31st of December 2015 and 16 are still outstanding, and the 31st of December 2017 full year accounts are now also overdue. These issues raise concerns over the charity's accountability and transparency. As such, the inquiry will examine the governance, management and administration of the charity, including having regard to the extent to which the trustees have complied with previously issued regulatory guidance, and also whether the trustees have properly exercised their duties and responsibilities under charity law in the administration of the charity, and in particular their duty to account for the charity's funds. It is the Commission's policy, after it has concluded an inquiry, to publish a report detailing what issues the inquiry looked at, what actions were undertaken as part of the inquiry, and what the outcomes were. Reports of previous inquiries by the Commission are available on gov.uk. And that is the response from the Charity Commission. Mr. West, if you could ask your second question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a very full reply. I understand it's going to be discussed at your next meeting in January. Is that correct?
I'm not sure, Mr. West, whether that has been confirmed. I don't know whether Mr. Hampton can help me.
I'm sorry, Chairman.
I understand this issue is going to be brought forward to the next Audit and Governance Committee in January.
This is the opportunity for you to ask your question too.
Yeah, we just had an answer. I'm just asking a question whether this issue will be resolved.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. West. I'll do two things. The first thing is that I will arrange for the answer I've just given to be sent to you, either on hard copy or by email. And secondly, at the same time, we'll let you know whether it is timely for that to be at the Audit and Governance meeting in January. I don't want to confirm that it is unless I'm absolutely certain that that is the case. So could you ask your second question, please?
I understand, Mr. Chairman. That's a very full reply. I'm grateful. My second question is quite amusing, because Councillor Beasley and I were in the Council chamber in Bournemouth, and there was a man videoing the proceedings. he was marched out of the town hall. I understand Christchurch don't. Now my question is, which has been edited, by the way, though what I did say at the meeting was heard by members of the public. So my question to you today is, the quality of audio recordings is very poor. Today's an example. Christchurch Council was much further advanced than this council and video recorded their council meetings. When will BCP Council follow their example?
Thank you for your second question, Mr. West. My response is that BCP Council has inherited the audio equipment in each of the 3 main office locations. In order to provide recording facilities for all meetings, additional equipment has been installed in the committee room in Poole at no additional cost. However, it is acknowledged that the age and technical specification of the equipment at each site varies significantly, and as a consequence, audio recordings do vary in quality. It is not considered to be in the public interest to incur significant expenditure on upgrading the equipment in all meeting locations at this time. At the meeting of Cabinet held on the 13th of November 2019, a working group was established to consider the options for the development and/or location of a single council hub as an integral part of the council's transformation programme. The outcome of this work will help inform the future meeting space requirements. It will then be appropriate to define the specification requirements for the installation of the new audio-visual equipment. And like the previous answer, I'll ensure that that is communicated to you either on paper or electronically, depending on which route you would prefer. Thank you for your 2 questions, Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please send them electronically, by email.
You'd like them sent electronically?
Yes, please.
Certainly, and I'll ask Mr. Hanton to attend to that. Members, we now move on to item 6 on the agenda, which was the principal purpose of today's meeting. I did ask members of the committee some time ago to make suggestions for areas of work that they felt audit and governance should be looking at. So we looked carefully at how we might go about this, and it seemed appropriate that we would have a presentation from officers with the opportunity for some supplementary questions. So the item at 6 is a statement of purpose and review of the SIPFA guidelines for audit and governance committees and statutory financial reporting duties for local authorities. The presentation is in 2 halves and will be made by 2 sets of officers because those are the fields of their work. So the first one is a statement of purpose review and the SIPFA guidelines for audit committees, which will be introduced by Mr. Stannard and supplemented by Mr. Milne. And then we'll go on to the second part and I'll do the introductions at that stage. So Mr. Stannard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the first part of this presentation, as Chairman says, is to just go through the SIPFA best practice document in high-level terms. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes at most, and then ask for questions to the presentation. In truth, the guts of this presentation will be Simon Milne's element, where we are comparing the current BCP constitution terms of reference of audit and governance with our forward plan, which you are familiar with, and then also with SIPFA best practice. So we've got a 3-way reconciliation between what we're doing as a BCP Council and with SIPFA best practice and our constitution. and make sure there's alignment there and identify any gaps and identify an action plan if there are any gaps that you want filling. So if we could just at real high level, you've got the SIPFA document in front of you. It's this document here. You can obviously read it to your heart's content, but there's two main elements to it. The first part is SIPFA's purpose statement, as they call it, and then there's some detailed guidance. So in terms of the purpose, next slide please. The purpose of an audit committee is in SIPFA's language, is on the left-hand side of that document, and on the right-hand side is the comparison with overview and scrutiny, just to try and understand the differences there. I'll just let members have a quick look at that. In crude terms, audit and governance there is to look at big ticket items around and provide assurance to those with governance responsibilities, an independent assurance on the adequacy of the risk management framework, internal control environment, and the integrity of financial reporting and governance processes. So that's the real high-level purpose. That purpose is not stated in the current BCP constitution, and if the Constitution Working Group did want to put an opening paragraph in front of the constitutional terms of reference of audit and governance, I think that sounds like a sensible thing to do. But obviously that's in your gift, and see whether that really adds anything to the constitution. I'll leave that to as an open question to you in that group. And then over on the overview and scrutiny section, that's more granular, and it's holding the executive to account on the decisions they're making and to review those decisions. I'm sorry if that's teaching you to suck eggs a bit there. I do accept that, but it's just important to get those differences up at the sort of front end of this presentation. So moving on, SIPFA then go in. Next slide, please. So SIPFA then go into what they call the core functions, and they are the core functions of an audit committee in local government as per SIPFA. We can explore those in a bit more detail. There are quite lengthy extracts in this document if you wanted to peruse those. There's a couple of things I just wanted to point out. Right at the bottom, there's the governance and ethical values bit. That's needs to be considered in parallel to a standards committee, where a standards committee exists. Some councils choose not to have a standards committee, and those responsibilities fall in audit and governance. BCP has got a standards committee, so audit and governance would usually look at the arrangements in place rather than the detail that a standards committee were looking at. And then audit and governance would then concentrate on the ethical elements of the officer. So that's where, for example, you look at things like the Gifts and Hospitality Register and the declarations of interests of officers at this committee, and you'll see that that's on the forward plan of BCP Council going forward. So that's. Is there anything any members wanted to just?
Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, thank you. Just picking up on that last element about the difference between the standards and the audit and governance. What I got from this is that the audit and governance, when I was looking at this guidance, is that it's not so much where the standards committee are applying the rules as they're set out. As I understood it, that they don't really necessarily address the ethical issues. The definition of the ethical issues come under the audit and governance arrangements to ensure that they set the standards, and then the standards are applied by the standards committee, and they're implementing it. In other words, it's almost like having operations and a strategic side. The audit and governance are setting the strategy for the ethical values, and the Standards Committee are actually implementing. That's the way I saw it. And also the overall performance of the Standards Committee, you know, who's actually responsible for that, who's monitoring it, how well is it working. You know, so my view was that there is an element of those issues that are the responsibility of the Audit and Governance Committee. So that was my...
I agree with your second point there around the performance of Standards Committee should be something that Audit and Governance look at. The setting the standards, if you like, is rather more nationally set, in my view. You know, we've got things like the Nolan Principles in public life. You know, they are givens. You know, the BCP Council may choose to implement further requirements, and that is certainly a collaboration between Standards Committee, Council and Audit and Governance Committee and all members, actually. So I think that's the sort of caveat there. So moving on, SIPFA then go into possible wider functions of an Audit and Governance Committee, and you know we've got just a few of them, as you can probably think of a few off the top of your head now. We look at things like the RIPA, use of RIPA powers, and they're falling into that category number 4. So this is where Audit and Governance provide oversight of public reports that BCP are making, and a lot of our things on our forward plan that don't naturally fit in those core functions are number 4 on there. You'll obviously recall that we have a regular slot of Treasury Management. We just talked about the ethical standards and the link with Standards Committee, and clearly the bit about risk control matters at the top there. So,
Councillor Stripley.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't quite take the way that item 2 is put there. To me, the Standards Committee should work alone, should be entirely independent, but I accept that it should follow what is set by the Audit and Governance Committee. But to me, the Standards Committee is like the police or the court. At the end of it, you only deal with people or individuals who've transgressed or are alleged to have transgressed for one way or another. So I'm not quite sure that working with it is appropriate, because for me the Standards Committee should be totally independent, but obviously work within the set guidelines.
I think that may be I 100% agree, and I think this document agrees with that. I think that's probably my lazy shorthand for that item, so apologies if you've got the wrong impression of that. You know, that's probably my words that aren't quite right there.
Well, you know me, I have a red pen for everything. Sorry.
Okay. So that's a really, really quick whistle stop of the document. And now I'm just going to hand over to Simon, and as I said earlier, we're going to just do this comparison on, and this is this A3 document that you've got here. And what Simon will do is he'll just go through. There's lots of numbers and letters on this. That I don't expect, we won't go through every one, but what probably more pertinent where the gaps are and why there are gaps, and Simon will talk you through that.
First time for everything. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name's Simon Milne. I'm the Deputy Chief Internal Auditor. Pleased to be here to hopefully explain the piece of work we've recently undertaken. So as Nigel has explained, the previous slides stated that sit for state, there's certain core functions that should be in place in every audit committee. And then there's a set of possible wider functions for the audit committee. So we've undertaken an exercise which has been interesting and useful to try and match our current BCP arrangements across to the SIPFA's good practice, as you'd expect. So you've been provided with a starting point of this exercise, which is this document, BCP Financial Regulations Appendix 2. This document alphabetically goes up to you, lists all of the individual functions of our current Audit and Governance Committee as it stands. So the first exercise was to match this particular document to, I can take you through to the large A3 document here. So to make sure that the starting point was right, that everything that we said we'd do as per the Constitution, the terms of reference in the Constitution, we were carrying out in an associated report that was included on the forward plan of the Audit and Governance Committee. Then we took that further and we matched all of the reports that were on the forward plan to what's suggested by SITFA's best practice. So the results. So if we take this key A3 document, the mapping exercise shows that the starting base is sound. So the very first column on the left, what we've done is we've mapped all of the individual letters, just for reference point of view, to check that they do map back and there aren't any gaps for the actual functions. So that's very sound. The only gap, I'll just take you right to the bottom of this document, is the item J right at the bottom, external auditor appointment. So that's not on the forward plan, but because it's a frequency issue. So we appoint the external auditor every 5 years at the moment, so that will come in a future item. But the good news is everything is on there, so we're starting with the sound point. And the other point to mention is you'll see a few gaps on the first column. That shows actually the forward plan and the Audit and Governance Committee is doing above and beyond what is stated in the terms of reference. So that's a point of further discussion. So the second part of the exercise, which is the column on the right, was looking at SITFA's Audit Committee terms of reference. So this is the real nub of, are we complying with what SITFA says should be in place? So again, hopefully it gives some reasonable assurance that, yes, all of the reports that are going forward do match most, if not all, of the areas suggested. However, if you take you over to the back page, this is where we've got possible gaps, but I'll take you through those because some of them are not gaps.
Mr. Mill, can I just stop you there for a moment? I think Councillor White, you've got a question.
Thank you, Chairman. One of Nigel's previous foils, when he was talking about core functions, on that list, one of the core functions was looking at value for money. Yeah, going back to Nigel's presentation, on one of his charts listed under core functions was looking at value for money and best value. Looking down this list, I don't see that coming out as one of the bullet points, and I don't see anything on the forward plan which addresses that. So I'd appreciate your comments.
Yes. In reply to Councillor White's question there, the VFM element is both included in the external auditor's annual report, where they consider their view on the adequacy of VFM arrangements in the council, and it's also in my report, the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report. There's a section within that report where I must make a positive or a negative declaration on what my view of the council's arrangements for VFM are. So they're embedded in other reports. That you're right, there isn't a specific VFM report, they're embedded in others. And of course, if you wanted complete transparency, we could change that.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Bartlett?
Yeah, I agree entirely. This was an area that I sort of picked up when I was looking through them. The value for money from the external auditor is at a very high level. And I mean, we're looking at, the significance level, for example, is millions and millions of pounds. And anything below that is, it's all minutiae in the overall value for money statement that they make. So my view was that, how do we actually test for value for money on some of the projects that we have specifically, We tend to set a budget for something, and as long as it comes within budget, then it's okay. But does that still produce value for money? And that's the question I've got. There seems to be a very ready acceptance that, the budgeted costs are actually what the cost should be. and there doesn't seem to be any forum for challenging whether those budgets are actually right. Generally, there could be lots of contingency built in or whatever. So it's as I said, it's just generally. I'm not picking out any specific projects, but I think that there is an area to be examined as to whether the council is getting real value for money in some of the projects and its expenditure. It's just a general thought that I've had for some time, actually. And it also, when I read this document, I could see that one of the elements that, within audit and governance should be to ensure that the council is getting value for money. And therefore I went, well, how do we actually achieve that? And whilst I understand that there is an overall value for money issue with the external auditor, to me it's looking at probably a too high a level. That was...
Chief Executive, did you want to come in on that?
Thanks, Chairman. I was just looking through the SIP for guidance on audit committees, and that has a specific reference to value for money and does talk about the high-level approach of the audit committee to be focusing on whether the authority's overall approach to value for money is in line with the governance objectives and to receive assurances of that to underpin the annual governance statement. So it does seem to me that's a valid role for the Audit and Governance Committee. We ought to build that in specifically. And I think this does go slightly beyond. So it talks about looking at the annual statement by the external auditor, but it goes slightly beyond that and saying actually this committee should be assured that the governance arrangements will give us good value for money and that there's a specific role for this committee within that. So I think that's worth drawing it out.
I would tend to agree with that, and I think a number of us wanted to put this onto our list of topics to be discussed. I know I certainly did, and there's always seemed to me to be a little bit of a mismatch between the VFM issues for the external auditors and how that applies actually through the work of the council. Because whilst I'm sure we all realise that actually it isn't in practice dealt with in the way that you suggest. In other words, if it comes in on budget, it's okay. So within whatever programme board or other alternative it happens to be, that is not how it works. That isn't transparent as far as the governance function for audit and governance is concerned. And I think what you're trying to flush out, Councillor Bartlett, is that there is here an opportunity to make sure that transparency is then conveyed through the A&G committee so that the public understand that judgment is being carefully considered. So I accept and endorse what the Chief Executive has said. It seems to me that that's a good way forward.
Thank you very much. Yes, just to continue on the back page of this A3 document. So as we've discussed now, value for money is an area that we can potentially add to terms of reference. These are the other areas that are bolded here that are up for discussion. So item 12 on the list, governance, risk and control, reviewing governance and assurance arrangements over partnerships. So although external audit may look at work of key partners of the council and forming their opinion on the accounts, internal audit will look at assurances and arrangements in place for partnerships. There's no specific report that comes to this committee to give that assurance. So that's the first one that's up for debate.
Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, again, in terms of risk management and control, we do see risk management charts at various levels within the organisation. But again, I look at the overall management of risk and the culture of risk management as an entity throughout the organisation and the systems that are used throughout the entity to effectively manage risk. It's carried out on very much an ad hoc basis of different directorates, but it doesn't seem to be based on some kind of corporate model in the way that risk management should be applied. It is a very professional discipline, and there are certain software tools that can be used throughout large corporate organisations and can be extremely effective, not just in managing the risk, but providing information in terms of where projects are, red, green and amber lights and all the rest of it. But I do feel there's a bit of a gap in overall terms about risk management. I'm not saying it's not being done. I think it's been done on a bit of a fragmented basis. And I think there is room to improve the way that the risk management is conducted and how it's informed and how people are trained in this subject to recognise the importance of the way that we manage risk management and the benefits that you can get from it. So it's a very general, again, it's a very general approach, and I base it on the experience I've had over the last few years in seeing some of the risk management reports flowing through, and they're variable, completely variable. And it should, we see large reports, with lots of information on it, but actually what we really want is are the reports by exception, the really nitty-gritty bits that really could have an impact. That's the sort of thing. I'll throw that in for what it's worth.
Mr. Stannard, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think you've probably hit the nail on the head there, that the fact that you're not receiving a report specifically on the governance arrangements, you're seeing some of the outcomes like the corporate risk register. There are things we're doing, and some of the things you've said there are right, and some of the things aren't right, but you're not seeing them. They're not being explained to Audit and Governance Committee for you to understand the full range of processes and actions that we're doing across the piece. So you're right. There are some differences, primarily because of legacy council arrangements, and obviously we're working hard this year to try and bring all those together. There is a BCP overarching framework, but then you're right. There are some operational differences as a result of legacy arrangements.
Mr. Milne.
Got it right. Thank you, Chair. Right, next batch is internal audit. So if I mention these three areas, then we can probably have a further discussion on them. So item 14, reviewing the appointment of external providers of internal audit. So at the moment, thankfully, that's not an item that you guys consider, but should it become necessary for you to consider alternative providers to the in-house service, then that allows that. Number 23 is the quality assurance and improvement process, and in particular the external quality assessment of internal audit. So that is something that partly gets presented to this committee through Nigel's annual report on the adequacy of the internal control environment, and that explains that we undertake a self-assessment against the best practice standards, but it also states that it does require an external assessment. That is something that we are looking at, and that will be brought to a committee in a future date. And lastly, it's like a right of access, this number 25, making sure there's free and unfettered access to the Audit Committee Chair for the head of internal audit. That's pretty much a given, but it's an option to make that very implicit within the terms of reference to this committee. If you want to discuss any of those.
Councillor Cox.
Yeah, well, I think this is really for Nigel. If in terms of the expertise that you have within your team, I've certainly found that it's quite useful to have external people come in who are specialists in a particular area, whether it's health and safety or child safety or whatever. Whereas I've often found that internal auditors, and I'm not specifically talking about you and your team, but particularly firms of chartered accountants who purport to be internal auditors, are pretty useless when it comes to internal audit, actually. And therefore I would encourage the council to use experts in a particular field that you can then direct.
Absolutely. If I could reassure Councillor Cox that where, for example, computer audit skills are particularly niche, and then it's not a standard audit methodology. So BCP Council has got a budget for buying specific external ICT auditor support to audit key ICT systems that BCP has. So that's just an example of where we do that. So we're absolutely aware of that. There are a couple of other examples where we might use external support, and we've got it built into the budget to allow that to happen.
Mr. Milne.
Thank you, Chair. Next section is external audit. So both these areas are not explicitly included within terms of reference. So number 26, so this is a role for the Audit and Governance Committee to ensure the independence of external audit and get assurances that has always been maintained. And then number 27 is making sure that there are effective relationships between external audit, internal audit and other inspection agencies. Again, that takes place, but you guys don't receive any specific assurances on those two. So again, up for discussion.
Councillor Cox.
Yes, one problem I had with this is the it did seem quite a long time, 5 years, in terms of reappointing them. And do I understand that we didn't actually appoint the current auditors, that they were appointed externally by somebody else? And to my mind, that's not right. We should be appointing them, and we shouldn't be outsourcing that to somebody else.
Mr. Stannard, and could you perhaps rehearse the transition from into external audit from the Audit Commission, so the progression we've gone through over the last few years to get to that point?
Sure. So what happened is the Audit Commission disbanded 2014, I think, from memory. Might have been 2013. Not quite sure now. And there's basically two options for local authorities. You can either enter into a public sector audit appointments regime, which 96% of local authorities have done. So this is gathering the economies of scale of a tendering exercise, national tendering exercise, reduce costs by about 40% on the overall audit bill to the legacy councils, and obviously that's trickled into BCP. And the other method is we could completely just go and tender ourselves. But there's obviously costs of tendering and then the evaluation, but that is absolutely an option for us if we wish to do that. All the legacy councils in Dorset and indeed the South West are voluntary members of the PSAA regime. So the PSAA is an entity that appoint the auditors on our behalf. And that arrangement is a 5-year arrangement to give continuity of audit for the firms to locate people in geographical areas. What PSAA have done, there's 6 audit firms and they broadly cover regional areas of the country. So Mazars, for example, do the North East and North West with a few London boroughs and so on. And it just so happens that Grant Thornton does the South West, and actually Dorset is the cut-off, and Deloitte's do the other side of the south. So that's how the tendering exercise and the PSAA regime works.
Do you want to come back, Councillor Cox?
Yeah. Just from a professional perspective, I find that completely unacceptable. That we virtually have no idea, we have no input into who our auditors are, and that doesn't. We're not being accountable as an audit committee. I was chair of an audit committee in a London borough for a technical college. They perfectly could appoint their own auditors, and we every 4 years we had a beauty parade of the auditors. And if they can do that, then I can't see why BCP can't do the same.
Mr. Stannard?
It's absolutely an option for us. We do have a right to comment on what PSAA are proposing. So, for example, if we have a conflict of interest and Grant Thornton were doing, say, consultancy work for us, it would be inappropriate for Grant Thornton to be our auditors, and therefore we'd say to PSA, no, we can't. We need another auditor, and they would appoint one of the other 5 through the national tendering exercise if that was the case. But they do the first allocation, and then they do ask us, and that's where Audit Committee could come in and so that's how.
Councillor Bartlett?
I just wondered, the PSAA arrangement, presumably that does produce economies of scale in terms of procurement. So if we were to go independent, potentially our costs could increase. Would that be right?
We're hypothetically, who knows? You don't know until you tender. The inference is yes, probably, because actually the huge purchasing power of that tender nationally did save 40% from the benchmark of the Audit Commission. But then you're into arguments, well, was the Audit Commission efficient and da-da-da-da-da. So, and in truth, you don't know until you tender.
And finally on that issue, Mr. Steiner, could you just confirm the date on which that 5-year period expires? Sorry to put you on the spot. How far through the period do you think we are?
I think I'm going to have. I don't want to guess. I think I need to go away and check that, and I'll send you that reply by email if I may. I'm not certain of it. I think it's the end of 2022, but I need to check that.
Well, just taking up Councillor Cox's various points on that, it would be helpful so that we can understand how timely or not a decision would be. Councillor Stripley.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, it's perhaps just me being picky, but I don't understand the way item 26 is written. To support the independence of external audit through consideration of the external auditor's annual assessment of its independence. Looks a bit incestuous to me, or navel-gazing. And maybe it's I've misunderstood something there.
Mr. Steiner.
Grant Thornton do it. They give you, as a committee, an annual statement within their annual opinion. One of their first pages is a bit of blurb to say we are independent. We haven't got anything to declare to you as a committee because we do this and this for you. So they make a positive statement to you as a committee, and you can challenge them on that, and so that's how that fits in practice.
Okay. Councillor Cox.
It's partly commentary, but they would say that, wouldn't they? Really, and I do find that it's a bland statement, which is fairly meaningless. In terms of the costings, though, from what I saw, I felt that we were being overcharged. And I think I made that point at one of the meetings, that they overcharged us massively on some of the so-called extra work they did, which was not extra work as far as I was concerned. That was part of their audit, and they should not have been charging us.
Vice Chairman?
Yes, not to find a point of it. A pool of 5 isn't really much of a choice, is it? Are we aware of anybody that's capable of doing this outside of that pool?
Mr. Stannard?
The government has got quite strict stipulations on what audit firms are able to undertake auditing in the public sector, and you have to be accredited, and only 6 companies are.
Councillor Cox?
I don't often quote Andrea Ledson, but I believe she has actually said that the next government, if it was a Conservative government, would be looking strongly at auditors and necessarily breaking them up because they have become a bit of an incestuous bunch. I say that as one of them, not one of 8.
I think it would probably be timely to move on. Mr. Milne?
Thank you, Chairman. So the last section's entitled Accountability Arrangements. So this is how Audit and Governance Committee reports its work to other stakeholders. So 34 refers to reporting to those charged with governance on its core work, i.e. looking at governance risk internal control frameworks, financial reporting, internal audit and external audit functions. So it's findings. It's saying report that to those charged with governance. We can discuss what we interpret those charged with governance is. Next one's 35, report to full council on the committee's performance in relation to its terms of reference. So has this committee done what it set out to achieve? And then lastly, 36, publish an annual report on the work of the committee. So they're very much all on a very similar theme about reporting the work. So again, open for discussion, but none of that is currently covered.
Are we happy to move on to the next part of...
Sorry, I'll try and take this off.
Councillor Bartlett?
Just to say that I think the county arrangements should be considered, and we should be looking to include those in the activities of the committee. So I don't know if you're looking for us to say yes, we need to include these, or no, we can ignore them at this stage. But I think that this is an element that does definitely need to be included somewhere in our governance arrangements.
And I think that comment was one that came through from members of this committee to me when I was canvassing for future topics. I know you made those points in some detail. So I think the answer generally, Mr. Milne, is yes.
Of course, on this. Got it. Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. I'm happy for you to move on to the next slide. So this slide explains that within this document that you've all been provided, the best practice guidance, there's some tools. And the idea is just to inform councillors that it's available. The first one on Appendix C is knowledge and skills frameworks of individual members on this committee. So it enables individuals to assess themselves whether they feel they have appropriate knowledge and skills required for performing this role, and there's a bit of a template for that. Appendix D is a self-assessment of good practice. So this would be a really good starting point for this committee to undertake this exercise and make sure that across all of the areas in this document we are complying, and it would likely produce an action plan of areas we'd like to improve. There's a question over timing of this. Do we want to wait for a full committee year cycle to make sure we've got arrangements in place? But then there's the argument, do we want to have foresight of what we need to achieve as well? And then finally, the last tool is Appendix E, which is saying, right, okay, we've established ourselves, but are we really performing and being effective in what we set out to do? And there's a self-evaluation scoring matrix at the back to enable us to do that, supported with evidence that we expect us to do. So really it's for awareness and consideration of potential further meetings. Thank you.
Mr. Stannard?
Just a couple of points from me. Appendix C is not every member must have all those. It's saying that as a balanced group, these are the sort of skills you need. And then the last one, Appendix E, that's very much linked to this annual report concept that, should this committee produce an annual report to council, and in that report, should it evaluate itself using that template to say, look, we've used SITFA's best practice template, and this is
Councillor Bartlett?
So would you envisage that being forming part of the Audit and Governance Statement, the annual Audit and Governance Statement?
No.
Mine's working. Might be just your side. Oh, yes, it is. Oh, yes, it is. It's probably that one. It probably needs to...
Yeah, I think
Mr. Stannard.
there are many ways to skin a cat, I guess, but one of the possibilities is literally the chairman, on behalf of the committee, writes an annual report. Obviously, officers may be involved in putting in, skeleton, so to speak, but literally an annual report that is very, badged the annual report of Audit and Governance Committee, and it goes to council, and it uses that template to evaluate.
The couple of comments I think I would make on this item, dealing with the Appendix E issues first, I certainly concur with that, and I think it was a point that was coming through again in the emails that members of this committee were sending to me when I asked for them. And I think it's important that there is transparency with full council about the work and accountability of audit and governance. I think there's a wider issue actually about engagement with members about the work of audit and governance, and I never get the feeling that there is the widest possible engagement by members of the council in the work that we do. I think I could put it that way, politely, and I think it's important that not only is that opportunity given, but that actually we do increase that engagement and understanding. It isn't just a theoretical exercise, it is one that has practical considerations for the audit and governance functions of the council. So I'd certainly be completely on board with that. I think actually our destiny is very much going to be of our own making in that respect. Then moving back to Appendix C and the knowledge and skills framework, as most people will know, I'm very keen on the training function of any activity that we undertake. And in terms of audit and governance, there are a number of opportunities within the council that we could begin to bring forward. There are also opportunities outside, and there are courses and training mechanisms quite often under the auspices of the Local Government Association. I'm going on one on audit and governance immediately after Christmas, and one of the purposes of that, in talking to their training section, who I know quite well, is very much about seeing whether there are other opportunities for members who want to participate going forward in attending such courses, because it's there that you get not only the opportunity to learn and increase the knowledge and skills framework, but also the interface with members of other audit and governance committees in local government, and that's a critical function too. So my intention is to find out what opportunities there are for members of this committee, and I will bring them back to you as soon as I actually have them. So I hope that will build on something for the longer term. Yes, Councillor Bartlett.
Yes, sorry. I couldn't agree with you more, and congratulations on finding the training course for the LGA, because I was unable to when I was looking for it. But I think, just generally, members are a little bit cautious about the ANG committee. Predominantly, it seems to be the place where all the numbers are looked at and the accounts are addressed, and it's very complex from their perception, which of course it is. But I don't think that there is this real understanding of some of the issues around audit and governance. It seemed to be just a matter of looking at the accounts, signing them off, presenting them to the council at the end of the year. And of course, it's not just that. And so I think what you're suggesting is absolutely right. And particularly in terms of informing the council through its reporting, a reporting system, I think is exactly what we need.
Councillor Stribley? Mr. Milne.
Thank you, Chairman. Finally, I shall just pass you over to my colleague Dan, who's going to take you through the financial reporting responsibilities.
Just before we do, because this is in two sections, is there anything else that members would like to ask on this first section of Mr. Stannard and Mr. Milne? Councillor Cox?
Just a clarification, because somebody told me, and I can't remember who it was to be honest, is that that if you're appointed to this committee, you can't be substituted. No, I think Councillor Stribley is a great member of this committee when she's here. But somebody told me that, and I just wanted it clarifying, just because of the technical aspects. That's all.
I'm not aware of that, but I'll get advice from Democratic Services.
Yes, Chairman, I know that there has been some correspondence, a few emails going around about this, but from Democratic Services discussing it amongst us, we're absolutely clear, and the Constitution is that you can have substitutes on this committee. The only exclusion is that members of the Cabinet can't be substitutes on this committee, which obviously is right. But other than that, substitutes are allowed subject to the normal rules and protocols.
Mr. Stannard.
Yeah, just for the avoidance of any doubt, where I think that dark came in, as if we'd chosen to have any independent members, independent as in not independent as in independent councillors, but independent members of the committee, they cannot be substituted.
And that was the case in the former Bournemouth Council, where the chairman actually was an independent member who was not a councillor. Councillor Bartlett?
I'm not sure if I've missed it, but one of the things that, and I've seen it, statement of purpose somewhere. Have we already covered that? And it follows on from what I was saying just a moment ago about the understanding about what this committee is all about. And I think in these guidelines, it talks about a statement of purpose setting out, what this Audit and Governance Committee is all about. And certainly when I looked at it, I felt that some kind of statement of purpose should be included in the Constitution, so that all members did understand what this committee was trying to achieve. I'm not sure if we've covered that already in here.
Mr. Stannard?
I took it that we have covered that already, and I think I got the nod from a few faces that actually a statement of purpose would be useful in the Constitution, and feeding that back to the Constitution working group that's there. So we'll try and slot some words in.
I think it's fair to say that's agreed. So we now move on to the second part of the presentation, which is on the statutory financial reporting duties for local authorities. And this is a joint presentation by Dan Povey, the Assistant Chief Financial Officer, and Jeremy Richardson, the Head of Strategic Procurement and Commissioning. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
I think I'm see where I.
Mine's going.
See, I think go round in the link. It stops here. So take the lead out the back.
Could I suggest that Mr. Povey and Mr. Richardson come up and substitute the places of Mr. Stannard and Mr. Milne, please?
Yes.
Underneath. Oh, I see. The lights were the lines, because they're set in series. When you get to one that's not plugged in properly, it will stop.
There's no light on.
Feel free. Okay, just get started.
Let's get on with the meeting.
Shall I start, Chairman? Yes, thank you. I'll cover the first part of the presentation, which is really concerned with the duties around publishing the annual statement of accounts. So obviously the publication of the annual accounts is one of the ways that the Council demonstrates its stewardship of public funds and accountability, and there are two main bits of legislation which dictate what the Council must do in demonstrating that, them being the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2015 and the Local Audit and Accountability Act. They cover 3 real phases of publishing the accounts, going through the draft accounts, the audited accounts, and then after the accounts have been audited, considering the annual audit letter from the external auditors. In terms of what the regulations mean by publishing, they really just say that it must include the local authority's website. So whenever we talk about publishing, we are chiefly talking about putting things on the internet. In terms of phase 1, what we have to do, once the Section 151 officer has approved the draft statement of accounts, which has to be done by the end of May following the end of the financial year, we have to put the accounts and the annual governance statement on the website, and that must be accompanied by an inspection notice. The inspection notice is quite an important document in that it tells members of the public, local electors, what their rights are concerning questioning the auditor and inspecting the documents of the council. And there's a whole slide just on that following this one. Once the accounts have been audited, which must be done by the 31st of July, and then, of course, approved by, in this case, the Audit and Governance Committee. We then need to publish again on the website the final accounts, along with the audit opinion from the auditor, and a notice stating that the accounts have been completed. If by any chance the accounts are not completed, and that was the case for one of the legacy authorities this year, we must keep the draft accounts up with a notice saying why the accounts haven't been able to be audited and get that completed as soon as is reasonably practicable. The final phase, once the accounts have been audited, Audit and Governance Committee in BCP Council's case will meet again, and they will consider the annual audit letter produced by the external auditors. They'll consider their audit findings report, and as soon as practicable after the end of the audit, we are obliged to publish them documents on the website. So they are basically the 3 phases that the regulations talk about, and I think the next slide really just drills down into the public right of inspection, because I understand this was an area of interest, perhaps for some members of the committee. So as part of phase 1, when we publish the draft accounts, we have to publish a notice that says what the rights of local electors are in basically examining the accounts, the records of the council, deeds, contracts, bills, anything that basically is backing up the numbers or the assertions in the annual statement of accounts. That period of inspection lasts for 30 days and has got to include the first 10 working days of June. So basically it's following straight on from the deadline of the 31st of May when we have to have published the accounts. You then go into the inspection period. The notice has to have the name and the address of the auditor so they know who to contact, and we have to make available at the council offices or other places copies of the accounts, and make available deeds, contracts, vouchers and whatever at the council offices during reasonable office hours. So that's all stated on the notice of public inspection. As I say, a local elector or their representative can come in and ask to look at what's behind the accounts. We're obliged to provide that information as long as it doesn't impact on the last but one bullet there, so commercial confidentiality and personal information. So with personal information, it's really about whether the information would identify a person. It doesn't relate to sole traders and suppliers of the council. That wouldn't be a personal bit of information. And obviously we have to respect contractual commercial confidentiality, and we'd probably have to assess what was being asked for against, what that confidentiality might be on a case-by-case basis. We might be able to release all the information, we might be able to release some with a redacted parts to it, or it might be all in the confidential bracket. We just assess that on a case-by-case. What the local elector can do on having looked at the accounts, having looked at the backup documents, is speak to the auditor and raise any concerns or objections with them. Now, they really have to be if the local elector thinks an item in the accounts is unlawful. so the council hasn't complied with whatever law and there's something illegal in the accounts, or if there's a significant matter that it wants to bring to the auditor's attention that might be subject of a public interest report. So a public interest report is where the auditor finds something where it's in public interest to put that in the public arena, report it to the body, and the audited body is obliged to get back to the auditor with an action plan about how it might address any concerns. They're often to do with significant governance failures and the like, if they are raised. So they're the rights of the public to inspect the accounts and look at the accounts. As I say, that all has to happen before the accounts are finally signed off. In terms of other financial reporting, and some of this impacts on what actually goes into the statement of accounts, there are other proper practices. A lot of it is issued by CIPFA, so Chartered Institute of Public Finance. The first one being the Financial Management Code of Practice. So really this governs everything we do, everything we report internally to committees, to members, which of course then end up on the council's website as agenda papers. And really it's all about identifying, managing risk and ensuring we're financially sustainable. As I say, the Financial Management Code of Practice, we follow that. It's not actually due to come into formal being until 2020, but we are taking on the best practice in the reports that you see from the annual budget report, quarterly budget monitoring, the outturn reports. Everything we report has got that identification of risk, management of risk sort of theme going through it. In terms of treasury management, we have to manage our investment and financing risks. So we bring reports to this committee quarterly on treasury management. And we also do an annual treasury management policy, which sets out what we call the prudential indicators. The prudential indicators are really for making sure our borrowing is a sustainable level. It sets caps on the maximum debt, interest rate exposures, policies for paying back debt and that sort of thing. It also covers the treasury management policy, who we can invest with. So minimum credit ratings, duration of investments and the like. So they will come to this committee. The annual treasury management policy goes on to council afterwards for approval, and they're all available to the public to inspect on the website. And the last bullet on there, Code of Practice on Local Authority Accounting. That really is the proper practice for what we have to put in the accounts. So that governs local authority accounting policies, the statements we have to include. So, for example, balance sheet, housing revenue account, income and expenditure account, and it also dictates the notes to support them statements. The legislation I referred to earlier, the accounts and audit regulations, also specifically refer to some explicit notes we have to put in, which are regarding employee remuneration, so the remuneration of senior employees and also the number of employees who are paid over £50,000. So we have to put that in the statement of accounts as well. So that really covers what we have to do by legislation and also all of the best practice that we have to do, which governs the annual reporting cycle. So I'll stop there, Chairman, and that's my part of the presentation. Take any questions.
Any questions, Councillor Cox?
Just in respect of the public's rights to inspect, I was slightly concerned that they would seem to have completely open access to the auditors, and that I suppose saw pound signs coming up as to what the cost to the council, which that might be, if they could direct lots of questions to the auditors.
Mr. Purvey?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think, if it becomes evident that an objector, member of the public, is being vexatious, is going over the top with unreasonable objections that are unsubstantiated, the auditor is within their right to draw a line under that and not carry on with that vexatious circle.
Auditors tend to have a materiality level which is usually obscenely high. Presumably they wouldn't deal with anything unless it was above that materiality level.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think if an item of account was being said to be illegal, then materiality would go out of the window. And if I think they were coming at it on the grounds of a public interest report, again, materiality and pounds and pence might not come into it, particularly if it's a governance issue. So I think it's a little bit different for when they're actually objecting to the auditor.
So I think, Mr. Richardson, you're going to pick up the final slides of the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. There's two key areas under sort of procurement regulations that we have to be transparent as a council about. Firstly is our spend and transparency of spend, and that is published at a level of £500 and above on a quarterly basis. This includes payments to individuals, goods, services, works, transactions with other public bodies. As a council, we actually take the central government level. We publish everything over zero, and we also publish on a sort of bi-monthly basis. So we try and sort of get that data out there as quickly as possible, mainly because of the freedom of information request. When it started under the regulations in 2015, and there was more clarification around what we were publishing, I think it very much helped compared to some of the sort of questions we were being sort of asked around our spend and that sort of area. So just to follow on from that, there's certain data that we have to include in that £500, whereas we do at zero. It's the date the expenditure has occurred, the amount, the department, the beneficiary, which is the supplier, the merchant category, value-added tax that cannot be recovered, and a summary of the purpose of the expenditure. So it's quite detailed. Under that, we have sort of regulations that we have to protect, obviously individuals, if we're paying through social services, and through certain payments that may put certain individuals at risk. So we may have certain contracts or certain payments to specific suppliers where we may determine that that is sort of correct, that we redact that data. That's still open to sort of freedom of information requests from the public, but again, we look at the scale and sort of try and understand the rationale behind what they're trying to ask us behind that detail.
Councillor Bartlett?
Where is it published?
It's published on our website on a monthly basis. We've done quite a lot of work over the last 6 months and prior to standardise our publication of data. As you can imagine, the preceding authorities, though we published sort of requirements, we published it in different formats, in different ways. So running a single finance system, we're now able to sort of issue a sort of a more singular sort of account of that. So it's on our transparency pages on the BCP website.
Councillor Cox?
Just to counter that, if you publish everything,
yeah,
aren't you being less transparent because you're just muddying the water and making it very difficult for people to see the important things?
It's a fair question. I think that there is a lot of data. Just to give it context, we have about 120,000 payments in the first 6 months as BCP, and that was part of the data. The original sort of guidance that was given to councils, which was slightly different to central government, was that we publish data on a quarterly basis. So again, if you think about 60,000 plus lines of data, yes, it's sort of confusing. So that was one of the decisions made, and all preceding councils had taken that on before, that actually we should be trying to publish on a monthly basis, so at least that data does have some sort of granularity to time and isn't sort of just a big dump of data. But to be fair, we do still get quite a few freedom of information requests around detail and breakdown of that data. So again, it was really working for BCP to make sure that we've got the right headings that were required, and then actually try and make sure that data, so if you think about the merchant categories, the departments, before there was it a service unit, was it a directorate, was it a particular department, was that information? So again, for us, we're still working, and I wouldn't say it's perfect, but we're working to sort of make sure that's as transparent as possible so people can locate and filter that data. Yeah.
can people take that and then filter it and
yes, it has to be in a CSV Excel format.
Mr. Richardson.
Our next area of public information that we have to issue is our procurement information. This is in two areas. One about what is our future tenders and what are live tenders, and also what have we tendered. This excludes anything that is archived and historic and is only actually contracts that are actually live. So again, we have a number of areas of reference that we need to publish. Again, there is a certain amount that we can redact depending on sort of sensitivity around those contracts for individuals, especially in the sort of social services areas. Again, bringing together, we all ran off the same system, so this is a public system. So basically our link takes us through to a Southwest portal. It gives us everything from a contracts register and also a view of our live and opportunities within our tendering requirements. So that is done across the Southwest. That's all the councils, and that includes now quite a lot of fire, police, and also it's now moving into sort of higher education and starting to use the same portal. We also have a requirement that anything over 25,000 goes onto the central government portal that is passed through from our tendering portal, and then anything over ODU thresholds are passed into European advertised block. So again, we have certain key areas that we have to publish. We brought together the single system, and again, we have a sort of around 700 plus live contracts. That contract register is absolutely live, so it's moving. We're bringing together many contracts where we're consolidating, where we had single contracts and stuff like that. But probably creates one of the biggest areas of freedom of information for us still. But again, we have to be very careful of what we can publish and what we can give to the public against sensitivity around those contracts. There's a certain life before we can issue detailed information around those contracts. So it is still quite a sensitive area. You know, I think central government and our regulations have really pushed that we are as transparent as we can be while trying to protect some of those bidders and contracts on the register. So, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Richardson?
I've got a query or a question, basically. This probably links into environmental matters. Obviously, we as a council have decided to try and get zero carbon emissions, everything like that. Obviously, we've got hundreds, thousands of suppliers who have various environmental commitments or no commitments whatsoever. When we go out for tendering for these contracts, obviously it's difficult to stipulate that whether these particular suppliers have got good environmental credentials or not. But is that something which this council is thinking about having implemented?
Mr. Richardson?
Thank you, Councillor Andrews. At our next, I think, committee on the 23rd, I'm bringing forward a paper around sustainable procurement, which actually talks about some of those elements. So we look about how do we collect that data, how does the agenda under procurement sit against the council's agenda of sort of 2030 carbon neutral, and how do we collect that within the rules that we can actually operate. So yes, we can operate and ask more detailed questions going forward, and that's part of our agenda. And again, how do we build sort of more sustainability into our procurement process through the specifications and then the scoring. So we're going to sort of embed some of that strategy, and we'll also have some embedded sort of rules under our financial regulations that sort of actually give it some support going forward.
I have one question for you, Mr. Richardson, and that is, I wondered if you could update us on the position within the procurement process for local and small businesses.
Again, part of the agenda under the transparency was that we gave transparency to local SMEs. I think the government doesn't distinguish between sort of local and SMEs. I think their agenda has always been around pushing more to the sort of SME level, which I think they hope would then sit on a sort of local arrangement. Under our rules, under 25,000, we have quite a flexible sort of approach. And again, in the paper that I'll be bringing forward around the strategy going forward in January, that will talk about actually targeting more local suppliers on our lower value, which was within our gift. And over 25 and the more formal method, that that we're more transparent and open. So all our tender systems and everything are free to our suppliers. How do we go forward and support them using those? And how do we sort of demonstrate that transparency through the system? So we are looking at different ways of sort of marketing our opportunities. Using social media is sort of a very key way, especially that local area. How do we get that through? And if you consider the sort of element of spend that is that sort of under 25,000 is quite high, and ideally we would want to support local businesses and stuff in that sort of sense. So it is very much, that was part of the agenda of opening the contracts register and the sort of opportunities to the public, that it wasn't sort of seen as a hidden, paid-for solution. So everything, the government's site, everybody to access is free. So that was always part of that sort of earlier agenda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson. Members, I think we've had a very comprehensive series of presentations and some very insightful questions to go along with that. So could I thank the four officers for their preparation and presentation to us this morning. A very useful exercise and an exercise actually brought forward by members of this committee for us to consider this morning. So I think it proves that by going out and canvassing with members of the committee which areas of audit and governance's work would you like to see on the agenda rather than the regular business of audit and governance has paid back very well, actually. And I hope that we can continue approaching these additional meetings in exactly that way. I think it adds value to the work we're doing. It expands, does it not, on some of the other issues we talked about in terms of our scope and our interest and experience in audit and governance matters. And I'd encourage those to continually come forward as other matters evolve. So thank you very much indeed, officers. Really worthwhile session, I think. Members, that does bring us to the end of our agenda this morning. And since we don't have any other items after item 6, I close the meeting at 11:56, and thank you all very much indeed for attending.